I'm Anthony Cervino. I'm a 2003 graduate of the Towson University Master of Fine Arts program. I focused in sculpture when I was at Towson, and I'm here to share a little bit of my work with you today, as well as to answer a few questions from the folks at Towson. I am currently a professor of sculpture at Dickinson College, which is a liberal arts institution in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I am also chair of the department here at Dickinson, and I am the co-director of Ejecta Projects, which is a art gallery and curatorial workshop located in downtown Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I run that space along with my spouse, Shannon Egan, who is at a different college nearby, Gettysburg College. The work that you're seeing on the screen is some recent sculptures. Most of them are wall pieces that I've made really in the last 3 to 5 years, most of them in that range, from a body of work called Long Lost. This body of work kind of goes a lot of different directions, but primarily it's looking at power dynamics between parents and children. It's also kind of a wistful celebration of nostalgia and of objectness, which I'm still very much committed to as a sculptor, making physical objects or manipulating them. This object is, and I was working a lot with these kind of found plates, these retro decorative plates, where I would take them and I would knap them, K-N-A-P-P-I-N-G. Napping is this act of Stone Age tool making, where you kind of hit a stone with another stone or with a piece of antler to make a sharper point and to use it as a utilitarian device. So I was doing this with decorative porcelain plates, which, as you can imagine, you go through a lot of plates in order to kind of get a point. It is very tricky as a material. Curiously, there's a subculture around people who do this for fun and as a hobby, and they mostly use old toilets, which is kind of interesting, porcelain toilets, and they call it Johnstone, which is, I think, a great little phrase. In any case, this one is a kind of axe made out of a plate that was very much about loving intentions. It's called Doubled Trouble. And it also contains a number of small little totems around its handle, which include things like a little lock of one of my daughter's hair, a fishing lead weight, the plug for my bathtub, and a set of avocado pit dice I carved some 25 years ago and just happen to still retain. These boxes are hung on the wall. They have a linen-lined interior. They kind of reference museum or natural history kind of displays. They're also fronted in glass. It's usually a fairly thick piece of glass that give it a sense of distance, but also this notion of value and worth. The sides of the box are also handled with different kinds of wood. In this case, it's a maple veneer. So it's this mix of high-low craft and anti-craft museum display and something that's much more domestic as well, all kind of wrapped up into a single object. So I'll show another one like that with more of the decorative plate napping. This one's called Gathered. And again, these are edited to some degree to reference all sorts of popular culture, whether it's an icon or sites. Or again, sort of a subculture of collecting things. Some folks only collect bird plates or cat plates, and others are religious in nature. Some are from McDonald's as commemorative objects. So in the process of napping these and building these points, of course, I'm looking at the iconography or the visuals on the plate and trying to work around them, but very often the plate has a different design and goes a different way on its own. And you end up with these little edited fragments that can sometimes be way more interesting than you would have intended, little side sections of things. This is a work, I collect Hardy Boys books, but I only collect one Hardy Boy book. It's number 27. And it's The Secret of Skull Mountain, and I have many, many, many copies of it. And I use it in this display as a kind of marker of time. And if you think about them as a kind of repeating film cell, but it's stuck in a stasis where it doesn't really advance. It just kind of repeats and repeats and repeats. You know, this work has that sort of directionality and is able to imply a much longer passage of this object, I think, than the singular book, for sure. And the book itself is significant to me in my own kind of childhood and my own history. But I think more largely, it's about that moment in childhood where maybe we tip from the kind of heroic notions that we have as children into something that's much more realistic. You know, it's at this, and maybe sadder, more dour, more more coming to terms with what the world around you is really about, and how it may not be as romantic as you had imagined. Yeah. And there's a detail of that. The cedar shims that run through it separate the books, but also kind of reaffirm its directional kind of the motion that the viewer has to take. Similar works. This one is called, what is this one called? Rescue Party. And it is a text with a found text with a made leather bookmark, a cast bronze bike grips, and with steel streamers all mounted into this case that sort of implies all sorts of things. Again, it gets back to the adventure of bike travel as from a childhood's perspective, but also kind of implies potentially something a little bit darker going on there, that girls would require prayers, and maybe prayers to protect them from boys. As a father with 2 daughters, this is something that is often on my mind, watching them grow and wanting to protect them from all sorts of things, and feeling unfortunate that one has to. This is the reciprocal piece for that, called Lost Patrol. And it really is a much more masculine piece, not just in the blue-pink relationships, which were very purposeful and playing off of a trope, but also, again, having a sense of wear and tear and a sense of improvisation, but also some acts of violence in there as well. So again, a little bit of a darker configuration. Regalia is a work that's very personal for me. It's an old work shirt I used for many years, including during my time at Towson University. This shirt, those stains are Towson stains, a lot of them. This work shirt had a good long run and was never, sort of the sort of thing you would throw on and then throw off when you were done with working. You put it over a t-shirt or something, and then it would always just sit in the studio. So it kind of was with me. It moved with me through many different studios and many different jobs and many different schools. And at some point, it occurred to me, mostly because there was a little grommet that had been added to it at some point. A grommet is like a metal washer that you would see on something like a flag. It really got me thinking about this as a flag type object. And so I mounted it in this box along with some other modified and made objects as a kind of historic or commemorative gesture. This one, really about, thinking through militarization, military regalia, and wanting to kind of allude to the sort of battlefronts of the studio, I think, more than anything. A much simpler gesture. This is called Beautiful Warning. Beautiful Morning is a song from the musical Oklahoma, and this fragment of plate is also from that musical. It was a little sort of scene from the movie, rendered, painted, and then applied to the dish. And I was able to free this little segment into something maybe a bit more menacing. And again, the idea with a lot of this work, when I mentioned it as being nostalgic, is that it's also sort of futurist. I'm really thinking about the rise of civilization, the fall of that civilization, and it being rediscovered many years later. So the rise of a new civilization, which I think is an important context for how these little fragments become sort of revered in the present, is by thinking about it through a lens of a future society that unearths them as a kind of archaeological record. Cradled, which is a real simple manipulation. I mentioned I'm an object maker, and even something as simple as the cradle itself, the black piece of wood that kind of normally would hold a decorative plate, in this case is, even though those are easily purchasable, these things are all handmade and made to look very specifically like a mass-produced object, which again, strikingly, is something I was doing a lot of when I was a graduate student at Towson University. So some of that manipulation, it's about craft, but it's also about uh, sort of erasing the hand from the work and having a skill set that allows you to erase the hand so that it could be interpreted as something that's mass produced. And then having the added kind of pleasure of discovering that maybe it's not. This work, sorry, the name eludes me in the moment, but uses a found photograph. It's very much about, it's called Manifestations. And it's a found photograph of a kind of spiritualist photography. Victorian spirit photography was a big deal at one point, where they would fabricate ectoplasms and other kind of spiritual activity, either through double exposures or through the use of real material processes, like having cotton come out, a string of cotton come out of your mouth or your nose or other voids. This one is from a later date than, so it's not Victorian in any way. I believe it's from the 1950s, but it has that same kind of process and energy, and so it has a level of production behind it already. It was a simple found photograph in a store, but it blew me away when I found it. And I've paired it here with a piece of driftwood covered in barnacles, but buried in that barnacle cluster is a horse's tooth from a jawbone I found, again, many years ago. And it's this idea of a kind of sympathetic magic at work, that these objects are imbued with not just a kind of implied meaning, but that they can actually have physical or a real impact on the material world. Again, that's just me kind of geeking out over objects and objectness, and rather than go through these much more specifically, I'll kind of just run through them. You can see my process at work. This one, again, very simple. It's a tiny little candle in a little brass fitting, but the candle is cast lead, and then it's treated with some kind of wax applications, a bit like an encaustic. And this one's called Last Wish. Now, these are much more recent. And in fact, the body of work you're seeing here was hosted at Muhlenberg Muhlenberg College. And I installed this 2 Marches ago, so March of 2020, March 3rd, in fact. And by March 10th, the galleries had all shut down. So it never saw the light of day. And this exhibition, which was a pretty massive space with all of the work from the Long Lost series, plus 2 massive installations or large sculptures added to that, was up for 9 months in the dark, and no one ever saw it. And in fact, this work, which was a really long sort of communal dinner table that took cues from things like Lord of the Flies or Peter Pan, the kind of Lost Boys dining surface, I guess. All of the work in the show was still very much about this kind of absence of parental information, knowledge, the handing down of information or the handing down of advice, and what would happen in those circumstances, and how we might envision a dinner table with just sort of geared around boys and boyhood impulses. And so unfortunately, this work, because of its scale, I wasn't able to retain it after the show. So in fact, it only exists in photographs, even after 3 months of work. There just wasn't really a home for it. It was a fun undertaking. I was encouraged in the space to do something experimental, which this was, and I was pretty pleased with the results. And it worked very well with the rest of the series that are in the boxes. And I like the idea of coming out of the boxes and onto the floor, especially this floor, which was a challenge given the pattern that was happening there. I also made a few little sailor objects. These little sailors are things I collected as a boy, little carved wooden sailors as souvenirs from beach towns up and down the East Coast. And I've been collecting them ever since, and I have many hundreds sort of stored away. And I recarve them is what I do. I go back in and I whittle them. And I loved going back to a real basic kind of primal impulse as a maker, which is whittling, which is basically where I started as a boy. The central one is cast bronze. The others are whittled away and manipulated, kind of to maybe comment on a kind of masculinity, a version of masculinity, again, that's maybe over romanticized and ends up being much more toxic than one would assume. And so I play around with these just for kicks, really. And you can see some close-ups of those there and how that whittling process works, always leaving a little bit of the original surface if I can. And as a tribute to those little ones, I made a massive version of one, the base of which was filled with little ones. If anyone had ever walked behind it, they would have seen, again, many stuffed in that little kind of cubic box there. This is a cardboard construction, just under 11 feet tall, and a single kind of gesture, one piece, with the exception of the pipe that does come out. And this you can actually see in the studio behind me right here. I'm happy and lucky to have Dickinson College provide me with a lovely studio with decent sized ceilings in terms of height and a lot of workspace. Now I'm happy to take questions, or I can continue and talk just a little bit about Ejecta projects and where that came from, the gallery I run downtown. That's okay? All right. So Ejecta Projects is the gallery downtown, but I'm going to back up to 2015 and talk a little bit about an exhibition I did along with my spouse in Dickinson College, or in Washington, D.C., sorry. Washington, D.C., we were invited to do an exhibition at the Flashpoint Gallery. I had been married and I continue to be married. We just celebrated our 21st wedding anniversary, but by 2015, we realized we'd never once worked together. We really had very little idea what was going on professionally, and maybe by design, with each other's careers. So I never read her dissertation, for example, and she was rarely in the studio to see what I was up to. So we made an effort to basically sit down and figure out a way to work together on a show and to collaborate. What came out of that were a couple different things. We collaborated not only on the object making, but on the writing and sort of curatorial stance for the exhibition as well. And so that resulted in a book project that is partially an exhibition catalog for the show, but also partially an artist's book with all sorts of extra little features, including a very revealing email exchange, an email fight taken directly from the web between my wife and I over strawberries, I think, buying strawberries, and who was doing childcare and all these other things that kind of come into that dynamic of what it means to be a kind of active teacher, active artist, active husband, and a contributor to your community. All these things meld and mash and come together. And often we're sitting there trying to maybe parcel them out. But in fact, in that mess, there's some beautiful things that can occur. And that mess itself is where we got the title Ejecta for the show, which is what is thrown up when like a meteor hits the earth or a volcano explodes. That's called Ejecta. And it's that mess. And it's not the event itself necessarily, but the kind of corollary acts of creation that might happen like in a studio or in a marriage. And so this work was fun to make, and we had a great time. And after the exhibition, there's a copy of the book. There was a wall text and other stuff as well, a fable basically that we co-authored. And we've written a few other fables since, but we wrapped up the show and we spent 2 years trying to figure out what was next. Where do you build off of that? And eventually we decided that it would take the form of a gallery in downtown Carlisle. We rented a space. We came up with a bit of a mission statement. It's not a nonprofit, but it is a labor of love, which means it's code for that it doesn't see profit. We are thrilled to be able to offer it for our community. We run about 7 shows a year or so, up for 6 to 8 weeks each with some time down in between. We use it as a curatorial workshop. We use it as a studio, to be honest. I do a lot of clean work down there as well in the backspace, in the office space. We use it as an office that supports our academic positions. And over COVID, we've used it as a place to homeschool, and we've used it as a gym, and we've used it simply as a place to escape, to get some quiet as needed. It's been great. We have hosted community events as well. And yeah, a few of the shows. There's a look at the space itself. We've recently, we were shut down for 6 months over the pandemic. So we're just starting to get back into the programming that's required to get us at least 6 months out, which is a lot of work, as you guys know for sure, especially since you had to cancel so much. And then you have people who were on the books and you want to bring them back in and make good on those kind of relationships. And so we're juggling all that right now. Our very first show we titled Valediction, and this is back in 2018 when we opened, which was our kind of tongue-in-cheek, assumption that we would fail as a space. So we said goodbye to start. And we kind of had a very positive response from the community. And between the kind of feedback we get from the community and the fact that we survived COVID and decided to not shut down the space, even though it was not open to the public, we're fairly convinced that we're going to be moving forward with the gallery for a couple of years yet, and maybe even growing it, looking for a larger space, larger building. Unsolicited submissions was a call for entry show we did 1.5 years ago. We had a number of applicants based in the theme of the show was really about the nature of contemporary galleries and how so many of them say very clearly on their websites, you cannot send materials to them. And as an artist who came through as a student artist and then as a graduate student, trying to find galleries to show your work was the challenge all the time. And the culture has changed even in my lifetime from very early on, where it was maybe still appropriate to walk in with a portfolio, a physical portfolio, to at least having some sort of contact with galleries through websites, to it being something now that is so exclusive that you really have to be a self-starter and just go build your own space, which is essentially what I had to do. And to be honest, I don't know how it would be advice I would give artists today is, on top of running a studio, run a gallery. Honestly, it's done amazing things for my creative practice and for my professional practice or professional kind of awareness. It's been a huge boon. And I'll also add that during my time at Towson, which again was fantastic, that's really where I fell in love with exhibition curatorial work, but also exhibition design. And it influenced the way I crafted my studio process and practice. And I was always sort of aware and kind of responding to that potential for exhibition or space or a curatorial kind of influence to impact the work. The very first college class I ever taught was an exhibition design class at Towson, which I still look back on, and I'm so thankful I had the opportunity, and wading through it was endlessly stressful, but it was a lot of fun. I had worked at the Maryland Institute College of Art before going back to graduate school as the assistant director of exhibitions, and we had done something like 100 shows in 9 spaces a year. It was nuts, and it was exhausting, and it was also thrilling. So I was a little bit aware of how, sort of how that energy could enter a studio space. And then after Towson, the very first job I had outside of school was down at the Corcoran College of Art and Design, where I was also director of exhibitions, but was able to teach a sculpture class on Fridays for 6 hours, advanced sculpture, which I had to negotiate. It was great. I turned the job down 3 times until they offered teaching, which was fantastic. And I eventually left that job to pursue teaching more specifically. One, because DC was a very expensive place to live, but also, I fell in love with teaching as much as exhibition work. Although it never really leaves you. The thrill of mounting shows and hammering nails into walls. Lastly, just to wrap up my sort of presentation, currently we have an exhibition on display called Scatter Terrain. This is our first show back after the pandemic. At this point in the pandemic. Scatter Terrain was a call for entry as well. We had 150 applicants around this basic phrase, this basic idea of a scatter terrain, which comes out of a gaming culture. It's when you have a little cluster of rocks or tree or a bit of a fantasy ruin that you set on a gaming table that informs the whole space. So it's a fragment that implies the whole. And I love that idea. And in fact, the phrase scatter terrain is probably been in a sketchbook since graduate school. I've seen it many times in many different sketchbooks where I would just scrawl it down as something to pursue. So finally being able to use it was great. Like I said, we had 150 applicants. We picked 21 artists from as far away as Bogota and Canada and California, Brooklyn, Texas, and even some regional artists from central Pennsylvania. And we're able to assemble this beautiful show. I mentioned Ejector Projects had aspirations of being a curatorial workshop. Well, we found, I think, our first show that we want to box up and travel sort of accidentally in Scatterterrain. And we're in the process right now of working with the artists to prepare the show for potential rental, and or maybe not even rental. We'll just let people have it if they can help with the transportation, to travel to ideally to small academic galleries that maybe lack a lot of space or a lot of funding or a lot of directorial kind of oversight, trying to get more work to help out other colleagues at other schools. So with that said, that's the last bit I have for today. And I'll leave it on this picture of I guess, other artists' work, because I think I'm in love with basically every other artist's work, more so than my own. So